Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. Let's see. I see a whole bunch of questions here. All right. There's a question from Lousy. Did I see recent news about a certain kind of wolf coming back from extinction? Is there a genuine business for bringing back extinct animals? Gosh, I don't know. I think it's mostly Jurassic Park style zoo kinds of things. I know there have been some sort of claims about, if we bring back the woolly mammoths, they'll, trample the tundra and change the climate and things like this. This seems really, really far-fetched to me. It seems to me like it's mostly a zoo-like story, which doesn't mean that it's just for people going to a zoo and seeing the cool dodos or whatever. It's also something where that's a way to preserve that form of life for the future for whatever purpose we don't really know. I mean, I remember this is now a piece of personal memory. It's very, very strange, but when I was a kid, it was the case. I assume it's still the case that like universities in England, like Oxford and Cambridge, they would have a kind of a admission exam that had this thing called a general paper where you would write kind of essays about random things. And I remember in my year, it was one of the essay questions was something about, is it worthwhile to preserve useless kinds of animals? Well, that was 1975, 76. The world has changed. People are much more oriented towards conservation in today's world. So the concept of a useless animal probably wouldn't be a thing anymore. But I remember writing, I have no idea what happened to that essay, but I remember writing about, well, you could just store the DNA and bring the animals back to life again. And so why do you need to preserve the animals kind of in the wild and so on? At least I think that's what I wrote. I don't really know quite what I wrote, but I remember thinking that was certainly an element of what I wrote. So now this idea of, yep, you could just preserve the DNA and bring the animals back from their DNA is sort of becoming real. Now, a case not for animals but for plants where that's a much more real thing is with seeds, where you can say, well, we'll store this seed for 100 years in, when it's in a sort of some appropriately cold condition, and then we can bring it back to life again. I think it's very unclear. I think different kinds of seeds have different abilities to be kind of just sort of kept cold and then still germinate and be successful as plants later on. Some of them, you can keep them for 100 years. Some of them not for so long. Some of them, you keep them for 100 years, and you have to replant them again after that time, and then get another sort of seed from the plants that you produced. It's kind of like a plant repeater or something. And for us animals, nothing like that quite works, I think. I mean, it remains to be seen whether we can make, for example, cryonics work and say, well, gosh, it's the last of the Galapagos tortoises or something. I remember when I was a kid, they had that at London Zoo, I think. And, kids like me could ride on the back of this tortoise very slowly. But I think it was the last of its species. And one could imagine a situation in which you say, okay, put the last of the species, preserve it cryonically, so to speak, and for the future, just as one could imagine doing that for people, if one could make cryonics actually work, which it doesn't right now for things like mammals and humans and so on. I mean, there are species that of fish, for example, that manage to be successfully frozen in ice and somehow sort of come back and start swimming again perfectly happily when the ice melts. Exactly how they manage to not freeze. I mean, the fundamental problem of freezing is that water expands when it's frozen under normal conditions, and so the cells that we have sort of will expand and explode, and well, there are a whole collection of related issues, and sort of it's a physics problem, so to speak, to figure out how to not have that happen. how to cool the critter down to the point where all of its kind of metabolic and other activity stops, but not have the cells explode and fail. But so I think that's in some ways a more that's a different approach than saying, okay, let's reconstruct the DNA and bring the critters back. There isn't DNA is a fairly stable molecule, but kind of the idea from Jurassic Park that, oh, a mosquito might have bitten a dinosaur back in the day and been preserved in amber and its DNA will be there still. I don't think that's a real thing. I don't think it lasts that long. And I think it's been a challenge to go back even for something like a dodo, where, so far as I know, there's just one dodo foot that is left over. It's in a museum in Oxford, I think. That's the place where one can extract dodo DNA from, even though dodos only went extinct in the 1600s or so. And I think it's not. But the other problem with bringing critters back is there's more to a critter than its DNA. And there's the whole lineage of the egg cell, and the egg cell has all kinds of other stuff in it in addition to the genetic material, in addition to the pure DNA. And you kind of have to find a thing that into which you can insert this sort of reconstructed DNA that you have. And so for a woolly mammoth, I think the elephant is the sort of the nearest living relative. I think for dodos, the nearest living relative is a type of pigeon, and so on. And so you have to kind of say, well, can you incubate the critter in a nearby critter, so to speak, and bring it back? For dinosaurs, presumably the nearby critters are birds, but they're pretty far away. So it's a challenging thing. And can you figure out sort of what the DNA of the dinosaur would have been based on just looking at the pattern of DNA of subsequent organisms? The answer, I think, is partly yes, although still there's the practical problem of just producing a big DNA sequence. That will be a solved problem eventually, to be able to make the DNA of the dinosaur, so to speak. So to the answer to the original question about is there a genuine business for bringing back extinct animals, I don't quite see it. But it's one of these things where I suppose sometimes with businesses, one might say, as people have in the history of business, who needs a plain paper copier? That was a famous line. Or who needs more than 5 computers in the United States? Well, what tends to happen is when things sort of become easy enough to make, you realize there are all kinds of uses for those things that go beyond the obvious. So, for example, let's say you bring back a lot of extinct animals. Maybe some of them are great farm animals. I don't know. Maybe it turns out dodos are really, we should use dodos instead of turkeys. I'm not sure. And in a case where we don't have dodos, and it's super difficult to imagine having dodos right now, but if it could be, I don't know, dodos on Madagascar, I think were fairly successful creatures before folks came from elsewhere. And I think that I can quite imagine that the dodo farms would be highly productive, much more productive than chicken farms or turkey farms. I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure it's in the descriptions, what dodo meat tastes like and so on. That's one of the things that it's always a bit of another difference from different times is, Charles Darwin, when he was going around the world and stopping in Tierra del Fuego, stopping in the Galapagos Islands and so on, he would describe these kinds of exotic animals. And one of the things he would often say about them was what they tasted like when you ate them. I'm sort of reminded of another. I think I'm telling a lot of silly stories here today, but when we first launched Wolfram Alpha in 2009, one of the questions was how specific did the system need to be to particular countries? There's certainly different sensibilities in different countries about what's the border of the country, things like this, what is depicted on the flag of the country, and so on. But one of the ones I didn't see coming was the question of what one says about rabbits. So in a country like France, rabbits are, commonly eaten. In a country like the US, rabbits are commonly kept as pets. And if you sort of get that wrong, people either are like shaking their heads or they're like upset to know the nutrition facts about their pet rabbit or to be told about things about rabbits as pets if they're mostly interested in, how many calories are they going to get by eating this rabbit dish. So just one of those strange things here. The Uz is commenting on the woolly mice. Yeah, I ran into the some of the people from the woolly mice company recently and saw the picture of the woolly mouse. I have to say, my first thought about it was I just kind of wonder what happens if you take an ordinary mouse and give it a kind of mouse equivalent of a perm. Does it look very much like that woolly mouse? I'm not sure. Susie comments, interestingly, would our atmosphere sustain dinosaur life considering there was more oxygen back then? That is an interesting point. I actually don't know. I don't know whether when you have megafauna like the dinosaurs running around, do they need more oxygen to be able to survive? I don't know. It could be that you need sort of the equivalent of the hyperbaric oxygen chamber when you go to the dinosaur zoo. Us humans still work at higher oxygen concentrations than the 20% we normally have in the atmosphere. So maybe you get this kind of oxygen high as well as the high from seeing the dinosaurs if you go to the dinosaur zoo. I don't know if there'll be, I suspect one day there will be dinosaur zoos some way or another. But that may be a while away. Let's see. There's a question here, sort of personal life question of mine. SK comments that when I was 15, which is a outrageously long time ago now, I started doing things that many would consider grown up. And curious as to how you went about attacking things that you simply felt like attacking. There's some people who would wonder about stuff but don't necessarily know where to begin. How did you get emboldened and what did it kind of feel like? Well, gosh. In modern times, it seems like it's a lot easier to feel like you can do stuff even if you're not already in a place where lots of people are doing similar kinds of things. In modern times, it's like everybody can put up a website. Everybody can, write a paper and send it into some preprint server or whatever, although I guess those things are now getting more institutionalized. But the world has become, I think, a much more open place in terms of many of those types of activities. When I was a kid, things like doing science research and so on was something, I mean, I guess if you'd asked me, do other kids do this? I would say no. I'm the only kid I know who does this particular kind of thing. Did I think that was terribly remarkable? Not really. I mean, I think it's something where unless somebody says to you, nobody else is doing this. How can you be doing this? Nobody else is doing this, which maybe people did say to me and I ignored it. I think that's probably the case. But it was just like, I can do this, so why not do it? And in terms of things like, I started publishing academic papers and things like this. It's just like in those days, I still remember, you put the paper in an envelope and you stick it in a mailbox. That was those days. I don't think I put something in a mailbox in a long time now, but I kind of remember sort of mailing it off. And it's like, okay, it comes back with all kinds of comments and this and that and the other, and eventually gets published. But it didn't seem like there was anything terribly remarkable about that. It's like anybody can put a paper in a mailbox type thing. And yes, there's a little bit of mechanics of, I mean, I started using a typewriter when I was very young. So, you can type the paper out, you're not handwriting it as would be the more natural way to produce a document in those days. And, you could use a photocopier. Photocopiers existed. They weren't in super large supply, but they certainly existed. And when it came to learning about what was happening in the world of science, it's like you go into a university library. And in those days, at least, any old random kid could walk into a university library and start looking at journals on the shelves and so on. I mean, I remember I did get some slightly funny looks, in university libraries as a, I think I looked kind of young, but as a, 13, 14-year-old or something. But I don't think anybody ever said anything to me ever. I mean, I think it was just like, what's this kid doing here? Must be somebody's kid who's, being babysat by sitting in the physics library type thing. But I don't think it was, I suppose that kind of openness has changed. I'm sure that the typical university library now, you have to have ID cards and all this kind of thing. That's become more closed, whereas, sort of the anybody can make a website thing has become more open. So I guess it goes in different ways. But this whole question about, I guess for me, the thing is always, is there a thing that I can see how to do? Okay, then I could do it. It's like I try to think about, when I think about things I could do and where nobody else is doing that particular kind of thing, it's like, well, maybe there's something sort of strange and wrong with it. But, and I certainly think about that. But then I just do it. I mean, like 7 years ago when I started live streaming our kind of internal software design meetings, nobody else is doing that. I think to this day, nobody else does that, which I find very strange. But, when I was thinking about doing that, it was like, well, there's reasons to do it. I think it's kind of interesting. Why not? And like, well, we could think about some reasons why it might be a bad idea. Like, you'll be in these meetings and you'll say something and it'll be clear that what you said is kind of stupid. And it's like, I don't really care about that. So so that's okay. And, the fact that nobody else is doing it, I don't conclude from the fact, I guess one of the points to make is, for me at least, from the fact that nobody else is doing thing X, I don't conclude that there's some fundamental problem with thing X, because my life experience has been that it is often the case that when you sort of think about things, you come up with something which is different from what people have come up with before. And the fact that nobody else is doing that might just be because nobody thought of doing it. And, and I guess that was true when I was a kid as well, that, the fact that maybe nobody else thought of sort of studying physics when they were 12 years old or whatever is not because there was some fundamental problem with doing that, just because I suppose I just was like, well, people just didn't get around to it or something. I'm not sure that I knew, if you'd asked me, is there any kid anywhere in the world who's, doing particle physics and so on? I probably at the time, I would have said, I don't really know. There might be. I don't really know. I don't really care, so to speak. I know what I'm doing, and that's sort of what I care about. Let's see. Riley is asking, I'm curious about the health trackers you currently use. At some time I used a Fitbit. Do you still use these? Have I switched to an Apple Watch? And they're asking what kind of way of tracking stuff is the best. I have been a little bit Paleolithic about that, because there's some really nice devices like the Whoop and so on that don't have certain features that I really want, because I really kind of only want to wear one thing, and I want that one thing to give me sort of text alerts and so on, as well as tracking things for me. And so I've still for now stuck with a Fitbit, although I have to say it's had a lot of issues right now. In fact, I always have two Fitbits. I have one that I wear on my wrist, and I have one that I stick in my pocket. For a long time, I used to clip it on my pocket, and then I realized that's really stupid. You can just take the thing off and just, take the little thing and stick it in your pocket, and it is pretty accurate at recording steps. It often disagrees with the number of steps that my wrist tracker records, possibly because I'm not I'm either walking on a treadmill or something where I have my hand more or less locked in place, or maybe I'm doing something crazy like holding a phone up while I'm walking around outside, and that's causing it to not record the steps as it should. So the one that's in my pocket tends to record the steps accurately. The one that's on my wrist tends to record heart rate and things like that properly, and also does some sleep tracking. I think it's probably not the best technology. I mean, all of these devices are using PPG sensors and so on. They're using somewhat the same hardware. I think there are some somewhat better algorithms for measuring things like heart rate variability and so on. I have, as I said, I feel a bit Paleolithic about these things, but every device that I've looked at has some problem or another. I mean, one issue is I want to be able to get the data off the device. I don't just want it to be sitting in somebody else's cloud because I want to do the analysis on it. I think with the Apple Watch, and I'm not sure this is that's still the case, that it's not continuously recording heart rate, but it only does that sort of when you ask it to, or occasionally, so to speak. And I kind of feel like I'm prepared to use the battery life, so to speak, to just continuously record that. That may have been fixed now, I'm not sure. I also have felt that Apple Watches are a bit big to have on one's wrist, but again, that's a I got an Apple Watch the day it first came out. I haven't happened to, we also built a bunch of things for making kind of Wolfram Alpha apps on the watch, and turned out that really wasn't a form factor people cared about. People used Wolfram Alpha through Siri and so on, but not directly in our apps. So that didn't really pursue that very much. But I have a bunch of other strange tracking devices. Like I got one of these 8 sleep things that records, that is a kind of a smart mattress-like thing that is supposed to heat you, cool you, etc. at different times for better sleep. I'm not sure if that works, but it also records a bunch of data, but it seems a bit unreliable actually, and when it sends you the data, so I haven't quite figured that out yet. But that records things like heart rate variability and breathing rate and so on. Again, I haven't known quite what to do with that. I've somehow ended up recording many different kinds of things. Oh gosh, what else? I mean, lots of things, and there are lots of other things that I kind of have. I've taken to doing a sort of whole body MRI once a year, and I measure all kinds of random blood levels of things, both once a year, and I have had these kits where you measure kind of metabolomic data once a month. Although I have concluded so little from that, I'm sort of always wondering whether those companies are about to go out of business and stop sending one of these kits that you stick on your arm, and they're kind of like a modern digital version of a leech, because they're kind of like, they poke a needle in, and then a couple of minutes later they've filled up with enough blood to be able to make measurements they want to make, and so you take it off and put it in an envelope and send it off. But those are a few things at least. But I have to say, I wish that some of the more specifically oriented sort of health tracking devices would do 2 things. One, just have that one extra bit of information of the way to sort of alert one that there's a text without one having to get out one's phone, so to speak, and 2, to make sure that the data is cleanly uploadable to downloadable, whatever, through some automated system, some kind of API. Let's see. Angel is commenting, going back to an answer a question about AI agents, which I've surely now forgotten. That most websites will be used for LLMs instead of humans. Should Wolfram Alpha's next product be kind of an Alexa-like, Wolfie-like thing? Well, what we are particularly concentrating on is, there's a question of, is there an LLM inside or is there an LLM outside? And we've been doing a lot of work on what we call computational augmented generation, although I really need a slightly different name for that, because since the sort of the world of AI agents and so on is moving very rapidly, and even since I invented that term, people have started using CAG to stand for cache augmented generation, which is a completely different idea. They both come from retrieval augmented generation, which is a slightly older idea. It's all about a year old or something. But we need a slightly different acronym for computational augmented generation. So if anybody can think of one, please suggest it. And it might be something that it may be computational language augmented generation, but I don't really like that. That's CLAG. But it might be that we just use CAG, even though that might cause some confusion with cache augmented generation. You always have to, but in any case, that's a mechanism where one can really let an LLM use the capabilities that we have as kind of a way to augment what it is doing. It's a slightly complicated mechanism because it involves going back and forth between our computation engine and LLMs and so on to eventually, for example, give you just here's a lump of text that is determined by the context that was originally provided to the LLM, and is something that you can then go on and use to inform what an LLM should specifically tell you. Now, you can also you can either return something that is quite structured, where a human wouldn't want to look at it, and it's really for the LLM eyes only, or you can return something that's textual, where a human might want to look at it. And in that scenario, we basically have something that is Wolfie-like, so to speak, that is really sort of a full intelligent assistant of that kind. I think the likely thing one will see happen is, at first, is some things added to Wolfram Alpha along those lines. It's been a complicated issue because sort of running something like Wolfram Alpha, we run it on our own servers, and sort of all of the expense of running it is on us, so to speak. We're not using outside services and so on. With LLMs, we don't currently run our own LLM server infrastructure, but although we probably will start doing that soon, and it's been sort of a question of when does that make sense, and how does that relate to the economics of offering kind of LLM-related services in our different products and so on. But that's something that is getting resolved, I think, soon. Probably will first show up in Wolfram Alpha, and maybe then will show up as a standalone kind of service. It will show up as a standalone service for use by LLMs. There's a definite path for that. A standalone service not for use by LLMs. It's just not yet clear whether we have the distribution channel to make that really work. It's for something like, a Siri or an Alexa. It's like you've got phones, you've got devices that at least play music for people. At least they're smart speakers, and so people might get them for that reason, and they sort of have them anyway. And then you can make use of some intelligent assistant on those devices. Although the history has not been so terrific, because the history has tended to be that what people are asking those devices to do are things like set timers and so on, not the kinds of knowledge and conversational types of things that are supported by the technology that we have. Let's see. Just is asking how to build that sort of confidence. Then, what if I overthink all the time? How to challenge it if I'm old already? I think that's referring to what does it take to just do it, so to speak, and start doing things that people haven't done before. Rather uselessly, I could say, having had the experience of doing things that people haven't done before and seeing that it worked out okay, is the best confidence builder for doing that again. That's kind of useless if you haven't sort of built up to that over the course of years. I mean, for me, I was lucky enough to basically start doing things that kind of, oh, I realized nobody else had done that before when I was, mid-teenager. And the things that I sort of tried to do got progressively more ambitious, so to speak. I don't think that jumping into I'm going to do this very ambitious thing on day one, probably I wouldn't have done that. It's a funny thing. I see lots of people who start companies and things like this, and there are people who just have they're doing things where they say, I'm going to do this. And you say, that's kind of crazy. That's really, really hard. But there's a certain kind of, people used to call it in relation to Steve Jobs, a reality distortion field. There's a certain kind of reality distortion that you kind of need to have if you're going to go out and do something bold. For me, I don't think it's a reality distortion field because I'm living inside it. And for me, it's that I'm going to do a project and my expectation is the project's going to work. Now, from the outside, somebody may be saying, what do you mean that project is going to work? There's no way that project's going to work. Nobody's ever done that before. People have tried it for years. They haven't managed to make it work. How can you be confident that you're going to make that project work? Well, for me internally, I'm like, well, I think I know how to do it, and this is the path I'm going to take, and I'm always a bit optimistic. But but I sort of have to. I think you have to have that kind of confidence, and it really helps to have done a bunch of projects before where they did work out, because then you kind of feel justified in that confidence. I think that, but there are certainly people who have what, at least to the outside, looks like completely irrational confidence in the things they're going to do. And sometimes when you see people starting companies and they are people who don't really know how to execute on the thing they say they're going to do, and you're like, this is doomed. There's this person who says they're going to build this amazing thing, but they have no idea how to build it. So sometimes you're right, it's doomed. But sometimes what happens is that person who has the vision and is, giving the whole sales pitch for it, well, they go and raise a bunch of money, and then they go and hire a bunch of people, and they kind of backfill the vision with reality, and the whole thing actually works. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it crashes and burns. But it's sort of a counterintuitive thing, because you'd think if you're talking to a person who's an entrepreneur who's telling you this amazing plan, and you're like, and you start probing them, how are you going to make that plan work? And they keep on saying, I have no idea. You might think that was just completely doomed. But in my experience, it sometimes isn't, because those people manage to hire good people who sort of backfill to get the thing actually executed. Let's see. I think this question about overthinking kind of things and sort of concluding that it's impossible. The way I tend to do things, I mean, I think about things to do, and I certainly think about what could go wrong. And some people will be like, how can you spend so much time thinking about all the negatives of what can go wrong? Well, actually, for me, that's it's a very, in a sense, calmative thing, because if I'm going to do something where it's like, well, I'm thinking about doing this, and what could possibly go wrong? If I kind of know what could possibly go wrong, it's kind of I know how far it is to the ground type thing. And if I say, well, it's okay, if that thing goes wrong, it's kind of, we can fix it this way, or it's not so bad, or we only lose this amount of money, whatever else it is. That helps me to kind of know in a sense how far it is to the ground if one falls. The idea for me, at least for my particular psychology, just this idea that there's no downside doesn't really work. I tend to think about it, but it doesn't put me off. And I'm also usually, as I was saying, very confident that I can make it work. And so I'm mostly looking at the upside, but I'm kind of checking that the downside isn't that terrible. Maybe we waste a bunch of money, maybe we waste a bunch of time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it has some reputational damage because people think we were kind of stupid to have tried to do that or whatever else. But knowing what those kind of downsides are, for me at least, I kind of always think, well, I can kind of fix that one. That one isn't so bad, and things like this. And so I don't worry too much about it. I have to say, as I've gotten older, I do less of that thinking about what could possibly go wrong because I typically, being more experienced, I kind of more immediately know these are some possible things that could go wrong, and these are the remediations of those things. I don't have to spend as much time thinking about those things. And but I think this tendency, I see people who are like, oh, I've thought about starting a company, I've thought about doing this thing. Oh, but there are all these things that could go wrong. Well, at some level, so what? How bad could it be? If that goes wrong, how bad does it get? Sometimes you may say, well, it can get so bad, I just shouldn't do it. But sometimes, the idea, well, things could go wrong. If you don't think about the things that could go wrong, they seem a lot more terrible than if you have thought them through and have thought, well, if that goes wrong, then I do this. If that goes wrong, if I quit my job and I go and try and do this, and it doesn't work out, then in a year, well, I'll have to go find something else to do. Well, maybe I can get my old job back, or maybe I can get a similar job, and it's probably going to be okay. Even though, there is probably some risk in that, but it's something where you can have reasonable confidence. You have a path. You know what to do. If things go wrong, you at least know what next step to take. And I think that's I see people where they've spent decades saying, I really want to do this thing. But they say, well, why haven't you done it? And they always say, well, this could go wrong, that could go wrong. I'm not quite in the right position to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a formula for later regret, so to speak. It's just like find a way to do it. And find a way to do it maybe that doesn't involve quitting your job, that involves you doing it as a hobby for a while or whatever else, so that so that you can kind of get confidence that you'll be able to do it. I think this idea of something could go wrong, so I shouldn't do it, is an unfortunate kind of self-defeating type of point of view. And as I say, my best psychological approach for myself is think about what could go wrong, and then think about what I would do if those things went wrong, and come to terms with, oh, it won't really be that bad, and then okay, fine, then I can just do it and not worry about that possible downside. Let's see. From L asks, should my next venture be based on an intellectual curiosity that might develop into something organically, or a big ambition? That's a hard question to answer, and it sort of depends on a bit on personality. I mean, the big ambition where you might just never get there is one thing. The small curiosity where you're going to get there, you're going to get to something, is another thing. What's the best thing to do? I mean, for me, I'm often thinking about things where I can see there's a big thing that could be done, but I can see there's also a path to get something done that may not be the full big thing. Another thing I should say, a lot of times when I sort of imagine a big thing sort of in the distance, then I do a thing that is kind of part of the way towards that. Then I realize that the big thing that was in the distance wasn't actually the right thing. Having done a piece of it, what I realized is, oh, there's actually something even more interesting than the big thing that I imagined that was in the distance. So I think there's a great value in doing things one can actually do. Having, again, with respect to people, and, I do know quite a number of people who, I might have known for 40 years. And for all that time, they've been saying, I have this big ambition, but they've never done anything about it. And, I don't think that's so much fun. And I think it would be better if they say, well, I've got this big ambition, but I'm going to do this part of it that I think is a core part that's really interesting, but it isn't necessarily the whole big thing, but I'm actually going to get it done. That seems more worthwhile. There's a certain tendency to freeze if you're like, there's this big thing I'm going to do. And then you say, but I have to take the first step. And that's something that's often very hard to do. I have to say for myself, the projects that I've done some big projects in my life. and that have taken a decade or more to do. And it's if I had thought about it as this is going to be a project like a company and a product, Wolfram language and so on, I started that, oh, what is it, 39 years ago now. And if I had known I'm signing up for 39 years of this, I would probably have had a lot of weird, oh, really, am I doing exactly the right thing? Am I, what am I, I got to be really, really, really careful because I'm signing up for the next, 4 decades or more to do this. And I might have kind of frozen at that point. So for me, it was like, I'm going to get to something. And then having gotten to that something, I'm going to see where to go next, rather than I'm imagining this giant thing that I'm going to build from the beginning, because that's a sort of formula to make oneself freeze, because it's kind of like, oh, I can't, even do it even slightly wrong, because I'm going to be stuck with this forever. Now, I have to say, in language design, for example, when building Wolfram language, we've been able to make a system that's been compatible for 39 years now. Something from version 1 will run without change in version 14.2 now. That's very impressive. It also required that we didn't make too many mistakes. Or when we made things which were kind of mistakes, we were able to bridge over them in a compatible way, so to speak. And it might be something where one might be totally traumatized by saying, this language design decision I'm going to make is going to be with me for the rest of my life type thing. It can't be wrong. I guess that I've done enough of these by now that I feel confident. And also, like, for example, I was doing a piece of language design right before this live stream, and there were questions about, what should we call this function? What should we call that function? It was live streamed as well, so you can find it. But the there were functions which we were thinking about giving these very simple names to, and it's like, we shouldn't do that. We don't know enough to be able to do that yet. Let's name them defensively so that that long name that we give them now, in worst case, it's like, well, we don't care about that anymore 10 years from now. But that short name that we really want to use for the right thing, we still have available. So it's those kinds of things that help you sort of plan for the future, so to speak. But again, I think that there's probably a certain amount of reality distortion about I'm doing this thing for the now or for the next few years, and that's the way you should think about it, rather than imagining it's going to be with you forever, so to speak. I think I've done things. I write a fair amount, and these days I write quickly. And I figure that it's more worthwhile to write more than to write a particular thing more carefully. I had a different point of view when I was working on my big book, A New Kind of Science, which I did for about 10 years over the course of the 1990s. There, I was kind of really thinking I'm writing this as a permanent thing, so to speak. It took me 10 years to write. I probably could have written it at least twice as fast. I mean, most of that time was doing the research to put into the book, and I'm glad I did it in such depth. But I probably could have done the project twice as fast, because I would have had extra energy from the fact that I was getting more done, I think, had I written it more quickly. And it was, it's nice that it was written for the ages, but I don't really see that much difference between the things I wrote there and the things I write much more quickly today. I was a little bit tighter, probably, I don't know, 30% tighter prose and things like this, but I'm not sure that matters. And so it's a better optimization for me to not be imagining with every word I write that it's sort of written for the ages, but just write as much as I can type thing. And that's kind of the approach. So I think my main statement about developing something sort of organically versus big ambition is it's worthwhile to know where you think you're going, but don't end up with something so big that you never do it. Is I think my response to that. The let's see. Gosh. There's actually a question here from Pali. Do you think someone will come up with an internal fitness tracker that will be more accurate? Yes. I mean, I think that sort of the big thing is to be able to measure continuously the levels of all kinds of things in your blood. I mean, in blood, because it sort of goes everywhere in your body and it's kind of picking up everything, and it's getting random cells from different places and so on. It's the commons of the body, so to speak. Everything gets in there. And today one can measure sort of oxygenation continuously. If you're prepared to stick at least a little catheter in yourself, you can measure glucose levels continuously now. But there will come a time, I don't know exactly when, and it seems like it's been almost there for a decade, that one will be able to just measure a broad range of things continuously in one's blood. So as soon as one eats something, in addition to being able to see the glucose level go up, one will be able to see, the levels of this go up and that go up and this go down and so on. And when one takes exercise, one can see this go up and that go down and all those kinds of things. I think that will be quite interesting. It will take a little while to know how to interpret it, but that's a thing, and that might be a purely external device. It might also be more convenient to just stick some small thing sort of inside and let it collect data there. I mean, there's a certain I don't know. For me, I'm like I prefer to just leave myself as pure human, so to speak, without too much sort of external technology inside. But I'm sure that if the value was high enough, I don't think that would be a problematic thing until one starts worrying about kind of the computer security of, I've got this implanted thing that would just be a measuring device. But there are all kinds of concerns one can have about that that one would have to address. Let's see. Rebel is asking, is capital becoming more free to take risks or more constrained because of complexity of high-earning businesses? Well, I mean, that's complicated because there are different sources of capital. I mean, there's institutionalized venture capital, there's family office type capital, there's angel investors where individuals are making decisions. It's a big spectrum of different sources of capital. And then there are the public markets and so on. I think I see different kinds of things going on. I mean, in the people who made their money in crypto tend to be more interested, that they're the ones who are more on the end of we're going to invest in the funky high risk stuff, is my observation. Then people, I think maybe what's the case is that people tend to invest in things that are like the things that they made their money doing, at least individual investors. And that's not a stupid thing. I mean, the times, I don't invest too much in stocks. I should do it more. But generally, my point of view is if there's some company whose product I use and not everybody does, and I like it, then invest in that company. That's a good heuristic. I'll typically, if it's usually tech companies, and I usually know something about the company and so on, and it makes sense for me to invest in a tech company rather than investing in a food company or something where I know very little about that industry. And it gives one a little bit of an advantage over everybody else if one knows something about that industry in general. And I have a feeling that for investing in companies, startups and so on, that the same is true. If somebody says to me, I mean, I myself I used to invest in startups many years ago now. I had enough bad experiences that I stopped investing cash in startups. And basically, my observation is if I'm going to invest cash, I should invest it in some business that I'm doing, basically, because that sort of gives me a better experience and I have more control over what happens. My experience with investing cash tended to be, it seemed like a good idea, or the people seemed good, or whatever else, and then crazy things would happen, and I would just get really annoyed that I was burning money on that. and I just decided it's just not really worth it. I do a fair amount of advising of companies, and sort of the end consequence of, yes, you get some equity stake in the company is kind of the same. And personally, I prefer to spend my time. I think it's probably more useful to the company to spend my time than to provide a bit of cash for the company. For example, I think I'm a poor source of cash. I'm maybe a better source of advice. I think I have been a rather good source of advice for many companies over the course of many, many years. But it's, there are many other places to get money much more easily than for me. And I decided back, several decades ago now, to stop investing cash in companies, except for ones that I'm doing myself. I've wondered about that decision a bunch of times, because it's almost sort of a social thing to sort of be an investor in lots of different companies. But I've been an advisor to lots of companies, and I'm not sure that it's worth the price of entry to invest cash in companies and then get really annoyed when they do crazy things and burn your money type thing. And maybe you have to decide that you're getting to the point where you're going to set aside an amount of money where you just don't care. You can invest at least that amount of money and just be sort of amused when the money gets burnt because some venture did something completely crazy, rather than getting annoyed that some resource of yours was squandered. But to this question of whether what's happened, I mean, there's sort of an evolution in these sort of investor pools. I mean, I think it's complicated, because often investment companies and investors start with an individual who made money doing something, investing the money they made. And there are certain ways that decisions get made then. Then what tends to happen is things get institutionalized. It's delegated to people who are more professionally money managers, or they're more professionally kind of associates at venture capital firms or something like this. And once that happens, sort of the thread is broken to the person with the original appetite for risk or sort of way of thinking about things. It's really become much more kind of a present things in a standard way, and will apply standard metrics to what you're talking about. As I say, perhaps, my observation, anecdotal observation, maybe the reason for this is because it is still first generation people, so to speak. It's still the people who made the money who are investing the money. That's a different dynamic than when it is sort of a professionalized investment of money. Not clear one is better than the other. I'm not sure. I'm sure somebody has made a study. I don't know the answer of who gets better returns. My guess is that some of the individuals who are pretty savvy get much better returns than the more professionalized kind of, we're not going to do anything too outlandish type folk. But again, I think that the manner of investing probably very rationally follows somewhat the way the person made their money in the first place, if it's an individual doing the investment. And folks who made money in crypto, that's a very speculative business. And so perhaps that's the reason that you see more kind of speculative investment, not necessarily in anything to do with crypto, but it can be in quite different things that are kind of physics-based ideas or biology-based ideas or whatever, but they're quite sort of out there. And maybe that's a thing that just comes with the territory of, look, I made money doing something out there when I invested in Ethereum or something back in the day. So it makes sense for me to, I have the vibe of what it's like to invest in something out there. Whereas if I made my money doing some very staid kind of structured business, then I don't really have that vibe. And that may be a completely rational point of view. But in terms of the complexity of modern businesses, I don't know whether businesses have gotten more complex. I think many people say they've gotten simpler. And I think that the fact that so much has been automated, there's another round of automation with AI and so on, but there's so many things where you can sort of put together a company out of puzzle pieces, and you can operate it with a very small number of people. Because so much has been automated, there are so many services that you can kind of outsource things to. I think in some ways, companies have gotten simpler. There are things you have to worry about in companies of which there's a sort of broader waterfront of those things perhaps today. But I think in general, for example, the total amount of capital to start many kinds of companies has surely gone down. To start you can be an individual programmer producing a remarkably valuable thing with today's technology. I like to think we've contributed some to the technology that lets individual people be super productive with Wolfram language and so on, with being able to use computational language to do things that might have taken, a team of 25 a long time to do before. Just that solitary person can produce that value because of the levels of automation that we managed to achieve. So I think, the other thing that tends to happen is, there's a certain pathology sometimes to investment because, I don't know, things can happen like that. The very fact that a company is spending a bunch of money on something can be kind of a form of signaling that makes that company do better in terms of its upstream investors or the public market or whatever. It's like, oh, you invested $10 billion in AI. Well, that's good. So, we want to invest in your company, even though that, all that money you invested in AI may actually not be going to a very good cause. It may be just the very fact that there's this, the amount of it is kind of a signaling of, yes, we're a company that's paying attention to AI or whatever else it is. So it can get a bit pathological. It's also worth realizing in terms of lots of kinds of investments that, again, to me, there are two perhaps distinct categories. The case where somebody is sort of investing their own money, or they're the founder of the investment fund or something like that, and the case where it's gotten professionalized and gotten to many more people. I suppose even in the case of investment fund, there's always the question of whose money actually is it? Is it a pension fund? Is it a sovereign wealth fund? Is it individuals' money? Whose money is it? And what kind of justification are you going to have to give about the investments that you made? And how embarrassed are you going to be, or how bad off are you going to be if something blows up? If you invest in something and it turns out to be really stupid, what happens then? And I think that probably informs some of the investment decisions that get made, depending on, in part, if it's professional, investors, it's, how confident are they? If they're like, if they say, well, I invested in this and that blew up, and they have to tell their upstream investors, that investment I made, that one blew up. But they can be confident that there are other ones where, they're very savvy investors and their upstream investors are going to trust them, versus ones where, it's a fresh new investment fund and the first three investments they made all blew up in their face. And then it's all rather embarrassing and unsuccessful. Let's see. Let's see. LC comments, how do you deal with really exogenous risks like a global pandemic happens with respect to innovation and commercialization? Not quite sure I understand that exactly, but I think, at some level, it's like, can you, in the ways that you lead your life or run your business, what do you do about those crazy, unexpected, meteorite impact type things? I don't think there's a heck of a lot you can do about it. I think you just have to, my point of view is, don't build stuff that's sort of obviously fragile. There are things where people say, oh, I'm going to borrow all this money and I'm going to do this and I'm getting all this leverage and it's all going to be great and I'm building this huge tower of things. And you say, but look, if the interest rate changed by 0.5%, isn't this tower going to come toppling down? Oh, no, the interest rate will never change, or whatever else. There are things which are sort of, in some sense, obviously fragile, which are, in my mind, one can get sort of short-term gain by playing on some of those things. But for me, at least, I tend to operate rather conservatively and tend to like to think that I don't have to worry about, if the stock market went down yesterday or went up today, or this or that thing happened. That's sort of a kind of a jangling of the world, that most of those kinds of things are not going to affect me because the things I'm doing are just not that fragile. I think that's my point of view about that. When a thing happens, well, then the question is, can you respond quickly? Can you, or are you kind of, do you have an organization where you can really respond and do something quickly? I think this is something which in the history of my company, it's now 39 years of it, we've gone up and down in respect to being able to do that. I think for me, in recent years, last probably 15, 20 years, I think we've been pretty good about that. It's but it usually comes, it's usually on me. It's usually something happens and I'm like, we really have to pay attention to this now. And it's like, okay, we got all these people, and the company culture is such that people kind of know that things like that will happen from time to time. And there'll be 50, 100 people or something who'll be doing something for some short period of time to respond to some opportunity or some situation that's shown up. Not all companies are set up that way. At different times in the history of my company, for example, in the 1990s, when I was working on my big book and I was being a kind of a less energetic CEO, I would say that the company was not good at sort of responding to the immediate opportunity or the immediate issue. I think we've gotten a lot better. It is interesting that it really does take me to make that happen usually. One of the test cases I think is sort of an interesting one when some news event happens and we have something to say about it. The question is, do we actually get around to saying it? Or are we just kind of sort of waking up by the time nobody cares about it anymore? And I have to say, in the past, we've definitely had many instances of we were just waking up, but at the point where people stopped caring about it anymore. I would say that it is difficult though. Something happens and it's like, do we have something interesting to say about this? Sometimes it takes me a day or two to realize, wait a minute, yes, we have something really interesting to say about that. We should be telling the world kind of thing. I give you an example. When the tsunami happened, this is how long ago? It must be 15 years ago, something like this. It was like, oh, that's an unfortunate event. It's upsetting and so on. People got hurt, things got destroyed. And I was like, that's unfortunate. That's a news event. It's happening. We don't really have anything to say about it. Well, it turned out we did have quite a lot to say about it. It turned out, well, there wasn't a tsunami early warning system in the Indian Ocean. There was one in the Pacific Ocean that had actually been designed using our technology. And when I sort of poked in the right place, there are people who sort of, a company who knew quite a bit about it. And then when it was a question of, well, can you actually simulate what happens in a tsunami? Well, actually, yes, we can solve these differential equations. We had all the information about the bathymetric data about the depths of oceans and so on. Yeah, we could do all kinds of interesting things that made quite useful graphics showing what actually happens and where there are risks and where there aren't and so on. But it took us a bunch of days to kind of wake up and do that. By which time the world didn't really, had kind of moved on. We had a similar experience many years earlier, early 1990s, with the Pentium FDiv bug, which I don't know, younger folks here may not know about, but back Intel, then sort of the very much leading semiconductor company, had proudly made this Pentium chip, the 88X, well, the sort of fifth generation of their kind of flagship line of microprocessors. And somebody discovered that a particular division instruction run on that chip gave the wrong answer. It was a bug in the circuit on the chip. And there was this sort of worldwide panic about, every spreadsheet is going to be wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and a sort of a big flap about it. And first, people are asking us, what do you have a comment on this? My number one comment was, there were people in the tech industry who were saying like, oh, Intel is a useless company. They should have found this. They're incompetent and negligent and so on. I didn't think that. These systems are very complicated. They have bugs. Everybody in the tech industry knows And it's sort of a fundamental feature. It's a fundamental, these days, I think of it as a fundamental scientific feature, a consequence of computational irreducibility, that there will always be bugs and they will be arbitrarily hard to find. So it's kind of like being a tech industry person and saying, oh, those Intel people are all dopes because this error happened in this chip, was just not the thing I was going to do, because I didn't agree with that. I think it's just, there will be bugs. There always are going to be bugs. And it was unfortunate this particular bug was sort of cast in stone in a rather literal way, as the actual masks for these semiconductors were sort of printed out on silicon and so on. But what I realized, took me a couple of days to realize, is actually we did know something quite interesting, which was if you do sort of, if you just take every number, you just say, what's the bit sequence of that number? And you say every possible bit sequence of every number is sort of equally likely to show up, then yes, there's a certain chance you're going to run into this bug. But on the other hand, in real situations, there are numbers that usually come from somewhere. You know, there's some number from some spreadsheet, there's some measurement, there's some other thing. The number comes from somewhere. And that means that certain numbers are much more likely to show up. The number 3 is much more likely to show up than the number 3.725645558, whatever. And again, the number 3.1415926, which, you know, is pi, is also more likely to show up than some number with a bunch of random digits. So there is an interesting science question, which is, if you look at numbers which typically show up, how often will you hit this horror number where the chip gives the wrong answer? And what I determined is the chance of hitting the horror number is very, very, very low. It's not the case. It could have been the case that that number was one that was sort of a popular number to come out of computations. It wasn't. And that was an interesting fact, which meant that a lot of the flapping that people were doing about my spreadsheet will have the wrong answer was just clearly nonsense. It was, you know, if there were 1 million people with spreadsheets, the likelihood would be that absolutely none of them would have anything wrong as a result of this particular bug. So, you know, but that was an example of something where we didn't really energize quickly enough and didn't really think about it properly in the right way to realize, yes, we actually have something to contribute. But, you know, those are very short-term kind of news-related things. But this whole question about can you sort of take your company and give it the expectation that there could be something where you decide we're going to do this and we're going to do it very, you know, we're really going to jump on this thing now. Does that happen? Can that happen? Does the management structure allow that to happen? As I say, my main observation about it is it really has to be me who makes that happen. And I usually have to cut through a lot of, oh, but we have this project and it was supposed to be due in a week. And it's like, well, yes, you know, I think I was the one who set that deadline. And now I'm telling you, go chase this opportunity now. So don't worry about that thing that was supposed to be ready in a week, because I understand that it's going to be ready in 2 weeks now because you're going to spend the week chasing this other thing. Let's see. Tim is asking, what are some early finance tips and tricks to teach kids to prepare them for the future? Gosh, I don't know. I've by the time I had kids, I had been running a company for quite a number of years, and I was kind of in a financially it was probably some of the things that might have been relevant when I was feeling poorer, so to speak, weren't really there. But in terms of, look, I think the main thing is sort of lead by example. Don't waste money. Don't, you know, if you don't want your kids to waste money, don't waste money yourself. If you want your kids to be, if you know, don't, you know, my kids are actually the ones of them who are interested in these things, which is not all of them. You know, my oldest child was very interested in business from a sort of young age, and sort of was very, very much asking sort of what is the whole financial story of, you know, the company and your life and so on. And at some point I was just like, well, let me show you all of this. And that was very useful. And, you know, I think, and it's kind of then I said, I'll show it to you, but don't tell it to other people. And actually, there were many situations in which he'd be with me, and I'd be talking to people about things, and he'd be saying, "You shouldn't be telling them that." So he was more kind of more inclined to kind of keep things confidential than I probably would have been, which was not a bad dynamic. But I think that the kind of the money as a mystery is kind of a mistake with kids. I think that the more kind of they can kind of learn from what actually goes on and what you're doing with these kinds of things, the better. I think in that's one comment to make. I would say that it never really worked with my kids to say, oh, here's an allowance of some number of dollars. That never really worked because they either had no opportunity to buy anything, or the things they wanted to buy were things that I wanted to get them anyway, and they were more expensive than their allowance would have allowed, so to speak. So it never really worked. I mean, I suppose maybe if I had, maybe it works better if you're, living in a city where the kids can just walk to the store and buy something all the time, then maybe that's a better dynamic. I don't know. I think that it kind of, I have to say it's my kids, I've noticed that they've started to be quite careful about, what's the interest rate I'm getting for this or that thing, much more careful than I am. So I don't know what led them to be in a situation like that, but I think that was so I can think about what I think they sort of understand that they understand something about what money means and kind of how difficult it is to make substantial amounts of money, and kind of how one can if one spends it, one doesn't have it anymore type thing. I think that the more that kids are exposed to sort of the realities of money, the probably the better off they are. I mean, again, I have an N of four. I have four kids, so I can't speak more generally, and of course all my kids are related to me, so that again sort of that makes it hard to generalize, so to speak. But at least that's been my experience there. Let's see. I need to go to my day job soon here, but okay. Ere comments, I feel like I became a friend with ChatGPT. Is that healthy? It's a good question. It's going to be an increasingly important question. I mean, people are absolutely going to make friends with AIs. And, the AI is going to know lots about you. It might know more about you than any person knows about you, even than you remember yourself. And that means you're going to have quite a bond with your AI. And, I suppose in a sense, I have computer systems that have all kinds of archival material about me that I suppose I would feel, it would be a very big emotional thing if those systems got destroyed in some way. For me, I would feel like I was, losing part of my life type thing by that memory being destroyed. So it's not even quite the same as if I was talking to an AI with all those memories. But yeah, it makes perfect sense for one to get sort of attached to one's AI that knows so much about one. Is that, I would say, backing up the data is probably a good thing. Otherwise, you might be pretty upset if somebody switches off your AI and they're like, sorry, those last 5 years of interactions that you have with that AI, it's all gone now. It's kind of like the person you'd interacted with dying type thing. It has a, so I think in terms of does it create a depersonalization of the person to be having a relationship with an AI? I don't know the answer to that. I think my feeling is, is there something fundamentally wrong with having a relationship with an AI? You could ask, is there something fundamentally wrong with having a relationship with a cat or a snake or whatever else? I think most people would feel there isn't something fundamentally wrong with having a relationship with a cat. some more people would be a little bit less convinced about having a relationship with a snake. If you say, I have a relationship with this mosquito, or I have a relationship with this particular, one would feel a little bit weirder about that. Of course, people feel that they have relationships with places, for example. Okay, another one would be, I have a relationship with this tree. Well, that makes some sense, but it's not quite the same thing as having a relationship with a person, so to speak. I tend to feel that the relationship with the AI thing, I would guess many people will have them. And will it lead to some horrible collapse of our civilization? Probably not. I don't think that's the vector for horror, so to speak. I had an experience last summer. Last summer? Yeah, it was last summer. A friend of mine had made a humanoid robot with a pretty realistic face and facial, gestures and so on. And so I did a live stream interview with the robot. You can find it on all the places you can find videos on the web. I ended up with a long, hour-long conversation with this thing, and it was sort of powered by a fairly good LLM, and the conversation was fairly decent. But the thing about the actual facial expressions and so on was quite engaging, a little bit bizarrely so, because having been talking to this robot for an hour, I felt very disoriented when I sort of then saw a person after that. And the person who built the robot was like, I think maybe there's some timing issues that are slightly wrong in some of the eye motion and so on. And that probably had not helped. I wasn't getting motion sick. I was kind of getting some kind of empathy sick or something by having this sort of strange feedback loop with this thing that wasn't quite responding in the human way, so to speak. But I tend to think that that's whether sort of it matters that there's some that level of sort of human affect to the whole thing. I'm not sure, but I do tend to think that sort of we have, in a sense, having a relationship with the thing that has a lot of memory about you is sort of, in some sense, having a relationship with yourself and your past, which inevitably, we inevitably do, and so it sort of makes sense. Let's see. LC is commenting, ChatGPT and my daily driver LLMs definitely know and remember more about me than I do about myself. Yeah, well, I think that's the way, and certainly the archiving systems that I have know in aggregate vastly more about my past for the past 35 years or so than I can remember. There's another comment here from LC. Seems like an idea in the kind of Computational X program. Why not something to teach financial literacy and key financial math, compounding and so on, notably for kids in interactive form? Yeah, it's a fine idea. I mean, I don't completely know the kind of visceral response to compound interest. At what stage kids really need to or do internalize compound interest. I'm not sure that, it's an embarrassing thing to say. I mean, I certainly have known the theory of compound interest since I was pretty young, but in terms of the visceral feeling of what compound interest and, progressive percentage increases, decreases, or whatever of things are like, I'm not sure I really paid that much attention to that until I was running companies. Maybe if I had gone in for borrowing money and things like that, I would have paid more attention to that. Just the particulars of my life didn't lead lead me into that kind of thing. But so I don't know to what extent I mean, I think it's another thing that is perhaps useful for financial literacy is roughly how much do things cost? I mean, I remember my oldest child from when he was really young asking me about lots and lots of kinds of things, from buildings to, things people do and so on. How much does that cost? And, I think knowing that even roughly is is quite useful. It's like, okay, I want to, take a trip to the other side of the world. How much does that cost roughly? I want to buy a car. How much does that cost roughly? I want to buy a house. How much does that roughly cost? I think that's sort of a useful thing to know, because if you know you're getting, $20 a week in as an allowance or something, and the house is going to cost $200,000, you can kind of know, well, I don't get to buy a house every year type thing from my allowance. But having that order of magnitude, having some notion of that order of magnitude, I think is quite useful in terms of the sort of mechanics of how things like, well, compound interest, prices of things, stocks, and so on, how that all works. Yeah, I think some kids are going to be interested in that kind of thing. Not all kids will be. Not clear that all kids need to know how to trade in the stock market or how to, buy cryptocurrencies and so on. That's one can probably lead a lot of life without doing those kinds of things. Let's see. I think I managed to get through a lot of these questions. Okay, here's one from Mane. When designing humanoid robots, what do you think is a key component design of those things? I mean, I have to say, I think that the next year to few years will be kind of a very watershed time for humanoid robots. I think, I think it is likely that there will be sort of a ChatGPT-like moment for humanoid robots. It'll be a little different from the ChatGPT moment because it won't be something where the robots will suddenly everybody can just use one. They're going to cost the same as a car type thing initially, and they're going to be fairly rare, but people will start seeing them all over the place. And I think that the hardware of humanoid robots in terms of the number of actuators, essentially the number of sort of muscles and so on, the number of joints, the number of sensors, these have gone up very rapidly in recent times. And the ability to use machine learning to sort of take the data from all those sensors and to move all those actuators in a reasonable way, that's really advancing quite rapidly. And I think in terms of the fluently be able to do the kinds of things that we can easily do, I think there's going to be a moment where that just starts working for humanoid robots. And I think there'll be issues about power usage. There'll be issues about the cost of different kinds of sensors and so on. There might be, there'll be issues. But my feeling is that it will become clear that it's just going to work. And humanoid robots, I'd long thought that was kind of silly to make humanoid robots, and it was mostly a thing for science fiction and a way to make movies where you could have, a person dressed up as a robot playing the robot type thing. But actually, increasingly, I realized that the environment that we built in the world is optimized for us humans. And so the humanoid form factor is a good one to walk upstairs, open doors, do things with open a can, do these kinds of things. These are optimized for sort of humanoid form things, and so it makes sense to build robots that kind of are plug compatible with humans in some sense in operating in the world. And certainly when humanoid robots really start to work, they'll be somewhat expensive, and there'll be a certain set of things for which they make sense. There'll be many kinds of kind of trade activities, I suspect, where they make sense, construction, factories, certain kinds of factory work and so on, where they make sense. For a while, there'll be a pretty luxury item in terms of the home market, I suspect. But they'll come in the kind of, in the hospitality market and the entertainment market and things like this, probably where more money can get spent on single objects. And they'll come in the sort of luxury home market, and then eventually they'll come down in price to the point where they're routine in the sort of everyday home market. I would guess that it won't be like kind of robotic vacuum cleaners where they're just not that complicated and the price could come down quite quickly. I think humanoid robots are necessarily fairly complicated, and so they'll end up costing a fair amount for a while at least. I mean, the pseudo science fictiony point is once the robots are making the robot factories, then the price can come down much more quickly. I mean, I do think that in the current sort of state of the world, that there may very well end up being sort of a wave of new sort of manufacturing capability that's built out, and it may be on the other side of the cusp of having lots of humanoid and other robotics really operating there, rather than on the side where, look, it's even if the humans are somewhat expensive, it's worth having humans do things, to the point where what the humans are doing is kind of tending what the robots are doing, and fixing the robots and all those kinds of things, and planning for the robots. And I think that like so many things that have been automated in the course of history, that will allow more things to be done, and kind of the jobs that humans can do will become more diverse and sort of higher level, and the things that are sort of more mechanical will be done mechanically by the robots and so on. All right, I think I should wrap up there and go back to my day job, but thanks for lots of interesting questions and comments, and I look forward to chatting with you all another time. So, bye for now.